Walk into almost any building constructed before 1900 and you will notice something that nobody ever warns you about. The door frames are wrong, the staircases are narrow, and the ceilings, even in the grand ones, even in the churches and the manor houses and the trading halls that were built to impress, sit at a height that makes a modern adult feel just slightly too large for the room. Most people assume this is an architectural quirk, a stylistic choice, maybe a side effect of different construction materials. They are wrong. What those ceilings are actually telling you is one of the most uncomfortable stories in economic history. They are telling you exactly how poor most people used to be. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The average adult male in England in the year 1800 stood around 5 feet 5 inches tall. Today that same average sits closer to 5 feet 10. That gap of 5 inches might not sound like much, but it represents something extraordinary. It represents a century and a half of better food, better medicine, fewer childhood diseases, less brutal labour beginning at age 6, and fundamentally more economic opportunity distributed across a wider population. Those 5 inches are not random. They were paid for, and for most of human history, most people could not afford them. This is the field that economists call anthropometric history, the study of human physical measurements as a window into living standards. And what it reveals, when you actually dig into the data, is that the standard story we tell about economic progress is missing something essential. We track GDP, we track wages, we track trade volumes and grain prices and the output of textile mills, but we almost never ask the most direct question of all. Were people actually getting bigger? Because if they were not getting bigger, if a population was shrinking or stagnating in height across generations, then something was going wrong regardless of what the official economic statistics claimed. The connection between height and nutrition has been understood by physicians for centuries, but only seriously applied to economic history in the last 50 years. The foundational work was done by economists Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman in the 1970s and expanded dramatically by scholars like John Komlos throughout the 1980s and 1990s. What they found, when they started measuring skeletons and military conscription records and prison intake logs and the physical examinations of men entering armies across Europe and North America, was that height is one of the most reliable proxies for net nutritional status we have. Not just what you ate, but what you ate minus the calories your body spent fighting infection, doing physical labor, and simply staying warm. Net nutrition, the surplus that is left over for growth. And when you track that surplus across time, a picture emerges that is deeply inconvenient for the triumphalist version of economic history that most of us learned in school. Consider the Industrial Revolution, the event that, according to traditional economic history, lifted humanity out of poverty and set the modern world in motion. Between roughly 1760 and 1860, Britain transformed from an agricultural society into the world's first industrial economy. Factories multiplied, coal output doubled, then quadrupled. Real wages, by some measures, rose. And yet, when you look at the heights of men born into this period, something strange happens. They get shorter. British men born in the 1760s were taller on average than men born in the 1840s. Not by a lot, but consistently, measurably shorter. The same pattern appears in the United States, in France, in Germany. Across essentially every early industrializing society, there is what historians now call the antebellum puzzle, or the early industrial growth puzzle, a period of apparent economic growth during which people's bodies show evidence of worsening nutritional status. This is not a small finding. This is the kind of finding that forces you to ask very serious questions about what economic growth actually means if it can occur while the people experiencing it are getting shorter. The answer that anthropometric historians have largely converged on involves two separate forces pulling in opposite directions simultaneously. Yes, wages were rising for some workers in some sectors, But at the same time, urbanization was concentrating millions of people into cities where disease burden was catastrophic, where childhood mortality was so high that surviving to adulthood itself consumed enormous biological resources, and where the dietary diversity that rural populations had relied on was being stripped away and replaced with cheaper, more calorie-dense but nutrient-poor alternatives. You could earn more in Manchester in 1840 than you could in a Yorkshire village. And you would also be shorter, and your children would be more likely to die before age 5. And the statistical average of wages would look like progress, while the statistical average of bodies looked like something else entirely. This is why the ceilings are the way they are. When craftsmen built houses in the 16th century, they built them for people whose average height was shaped by conditions that we would today recognize as chronic moderate malnutrition, not starvation, not. The kind of nutritional deficit that operates invisibly across generations, clipping potential height year by year by year. In England in 1600, the average height for adult men has been estimated at around 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 7 inches. That number had barely moved from where it sat in the Roman period. For more than 1,000 years, through the medieval agricultural expansion and the Black Death and the early modern commercial revolution, average heights in Western Europe remained in a range that tells you unambiguously that most people were not eating enough of the right things often enough to reach their biological potential. The buildings encoded that, not intentionally. Nobody sat down and said, let us build this doorframe to be 5 feet 10 so it matches the average poor man of this era. But generations of craftsmen built doorframes that their own bodies could walk through without ducking. They built beds the length of the people who would sleep in them. They built chairs with backs that hit at the height of the shoulders of the people who would sit in them. Architecture is, among other things, an accidental census of the bodies that populated it. This is what makes historic buildings such extraordinary documents, not the grand decorative programs, not the stylistic vocabularies, the raw dimensions, the distance between floor and ceiling, the width of a staircase, the height of a kitchen counter. These numbers are biometric data. They are telling you how tall people were. And how tall people were is telling you how well fed they were. And how well fed they were is telling you something about the real economic conditions of their lives that no wage record or tax ledger can quite capture with the same directness. Now here is where it gets even more revealing. Because the low ceilings were not universal, even within the same era. They were distributed by class with extraordinary precision. The great aristocratic houses of Tudor England often featured halls with ceilings of 14 or 15 feet. The rooms of the nobility were generous. The chambers of bishops and lords were sometimes almost cavernous by the standards of the time. And the skeletons of wealthy men from those same centuries consistently show them running an inch, sometimes 2 inches, taller than their labouring contemporaries. The food that built height was not equally available. It was rationed by wealth, by access, by the proximity of your family's table to the outputs of the best agricultural land. Meat was a luxury item for most of European history. Dairy was seasonal and unreliable for the poor. The proteins and fats that bone growth requires were consumed disproportionately by the people who could pay for them, and the buildings those people occupied had higher ceilings because their bodies demanded more vertical space. This gives us a way of reading any historic structure as a kind of biological class document. Walk into the servants' quarters of an 18th century country house and then walk into the main reception rooms. The ceiling heights are different, not just for aesthetic reasons, because the people expected to occupy those spaces were, on average, physically different sizes. The architecture encodes not just the era's average poverty, but the era's specific inequalities of nutrition and health. Historians studying medieval Europe have documented this with particular clarity. Skeletal remains from aristocratic burial sites of the 12th and 13th centuries show men averaging around 5 feet 8 inches. Skeletal remains from ordinary parish churchyards of the same period show men averaging closer to 5 feet 5, 3 inches of class difference written into the bones, reflecting lifetimes of divergent diet. The Lord ate roasted meat and white bread and drank wine. The serf ate coarse grain porridge and root vegetables and was lucky to see meat once a week. Their bodies recorded that bargain permanently. What is perhaps most striking is how recently, in historical terms, the break happened. The acceleration in average height that separates our bodies from those of people in medieval paintings and Tudor portraits did not begin with the Industrial Revolution. If anything, as we have seen, early industrialization briefly reversed gains that had tentatively begun in the 18th century. The real sustained height increase in the populations of wealthy nations begins in the late 19th century and accelerates sharply through the 20th. It tracks almost precisely with the expansion of public health infrastructure, clean water systems, sewage treatment, childhood vaccination programs, subsidized food programs, minimum wage legislation, the welfare state, in other words, not markets alone, not industrial output alone. The biological payoff of the modern era came from the collective decision to distribute nutrition and disease protection more broadly across populations, rather than concentrating the gains of economic growth in fewer and fewer hands, while the majority remained at the nutritional margin. Komlos, whose work spans decades and dozens of countries, has made the further observation that height gains in the United States began slowing and then stagnating in the latter decades of the 20th century, even as GDP continued to rise. Americans, who were among the tallest people in the world in the 1950s, now rank roughly 37th in average height globally, behind most of Western and Northern Europe. This has happened during a period of extraordinary aggregate economic growth. What it has not happened during is a period of broadly distributed nutritional and healthcare security. The net nutrition surplus that drives height is being captured by a narrower and narrower slice of the population, and the bodies of the rest are recording that fact quietly and precisely, the same way the bodies of mill workers in 1830 recorded it. The implications of this are worth sitting with. We tend to think of the economic statistics that appear in newspapers and policy documents, the GDP figures, the productivity indices, the stock market levels, as measuring something real about the welfare of a society. And they measure something, but they do not measure what bodies measure. A society can grow richer in aggregate while the majority of its people grow biologically poorer. This has happened before. It is happening in measurable ways right now. And the buildings of the future, if we could look back at them a century from now the way we look back at a medieval cottage today, would tell the story of who got the surplus and who did not with the same mute precision. There is something almost poetic about the physical record that buildings provide. Every time a tall modern person ducks through a doorframe in an old farmhouse or stands in a medieval great hall and realizes the ceiling is barely a foot above their head, they are experiencing a data point, a direct embodied encounter with the economic history of the people who built that room. Those people were not small because medieval people were small. They were not small because human beings used to be a shorter species. They were small because they were poor in a specific, measurable, biological way. They were small because the food they could access and the disease burden they carried and the labour they performed from childhood left too little surplus for their bones to do what bones can do when circumstances allow. The ceilings are low because the calories were scarce. The door frames are narrow because the protein was insufficient. The beds are short because childhood illness cost years of growth that were never recovered. And the distance between those dimensions and our own is not a story of inevitable human progress, driven by free markets and industrial genius. It is a story about what happens to bodies when societies decide, slowly and imperfectly, and never completely, to share the surplus more widely. Walk into an old building and look up. The ceiling is telling you something. The question is whether you are willing to hear it. The ceilings in old buildings were built for shorter people because shorter people is what poverty produces. Track human height across any century and you are tracking who ate, who thrived, and who bore the hidden cost of economic growth. The bones do not lie the way the ledgers do. The buildings do not lie the way the statistics do. Thank you for watching and subscribe for more history the textbooks quietly left out.